been a week. Really great to have all of you here. Obviously, we could not be more on the moment with the discussion we're about to have. I'd like to capture a perspective from outside of Canada first, because I think most of us in this room have been living this experience from, the outside looking in. So Collin, could you, inside looking out at us, and say what it's been like to watch this unfold? What is the tone in the United States right now with respect to tariffs?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say how grateful I am to be here. Border crossing was very easy, which I was a little nervous about. But honestly, it's very good to be here speaking with you today, and to be on the stage with my colleagues here. As I looked over this question, I tried to think about how I would speak to this and how I'd prepare. And as an association, we represent about 500 suppliers to the automotive and commercial vehicle market. And I'm going to take this in a couple ways. As an association, I walked away with a lot of pride. There was a lot of action, and I couldn't have been more proud with how we handled the situation. Getting on the phone, we spoke to probably 1,000 people over the last couple of days of our members, making sure that they had the information, because just as everybody else in this room was scrambling, we were scrambling as well. There was a lot of information we were lacking that we normally would have, because it's hard to think, but this administration's 3 weeks old. The velocity of things coming at us is absolute insanity right now. And I was incredibly proud of our entire organization and how we were able to roster everything. Now, personally, I think I went through a huge range of emotions since last Friday, when things started to pick up more seriously. A little bit of a feeling of helplessness. Normally, where there's an administration in place that you can work with and talk to various people, there really wasn't. And so even our team in Washington, D.C. Had that feeling a little bit of, who do we turn to, who do we talk to, who are the key people involved? At times, feelings of frustration. What is important for our association and myself is, while 25% of automobiles manufactured for the United States come from Mexico, our members, about 35 to 37% of their products and supplier production comes from Mexico. And then you think about what happens at the border between Detroit and Windsor. That's about a third to a quarter of all trade between United States and Canada. So making sure that relationship is kept in sync was probably the number one thing that was on our mind at that time. How do we disseminate the right information? How do we make sure that people understand how important this relationship is? And the fact that in North America, we can't have automotive without a healthy USMCA. But I think personally, it ran the entire gamut. It feels like it's been a little more than a week. I think we're all collectively a little bit tired, but I personally, at this point, I'm pretty energized because of what I've seen in the collective, how we've all got together, helped everybody understand what's happening out there, and disseminate information. So, a little long-winded, but it's been crazy.
No, I appreciate that. I think
the administration is 2 weeks old, not 3.
That's how maybe it's in its third week.
That's how bad it is.
I don't even know. I was driving up here, and I called my wife. I'm like, yeah, I just put in the nav where I'm supposed to go. My team got me a hotel. I'm just going from one thing to the next, and here we are.
Yep. No, and I think, like you summed it up, I think everyone in the room, and usually I would start off a panel like this with a bit of a spiel about introducing the topic, but I think we've all heard so much about it, and everyone is just like tired. Not tired of discussing it, but just tired from like the surge of emotions that we've all had and the stressors it's put on everyone. I don't think we can discount that at all, so thank you for being candid about that. So Francisco, from Mexico's perspective, obviously Mexico was told that it was going to be subjected to tariffs as well. Mexico actually got that 30-day deferral before Canada did, but because Collin has also brought up the USMCA agreement, I'd like to get your thoughts on both of those things. So what's Mexico going to do with the next 30 days to try to find a more permanent solution, and then looking even further down the line at USMCA the likely renegotiation of that?
Obviously, we're living now the tea times, and this doesn't compete with the coffee. It's the Trump times. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. This tea times also implicates the tea of threats, the tea of tariffs, the tea of taxes, the tea of tired, that you mentioned, turbulence. But after this letter, it comes the EU, USMCA, and uncertainty. When we were talking with our associates, as you did in the weekend, it was really amazing. Also, I don't know how many calls. We have 735 members, and they were calling really with some anxiety, some of them asking which sanctions should we retaliate with. And the decision of the government was cool head, and let's think what to do about next steps. It's the same situation now for the next 30 days. And the idea is not starting and escalating this, not negotiation, but situation, and really focusing on what's the problem. It's migration and fentanyl. It's not tariffs. Remember the issue with Petro in Colombia. Our government is taking the measures in this direction and not thinking on retaliation. We had the tariffs in 2018 when steel and aluminum were implicated in tariffs, and that could we manage because it was directed to products, but a general 25% is not credible. It's out of sense, and we couldn't retaliate with 25% when everything. It would also hurt Mexican consumers. Then the decision of the government is, and still be, negotiate around the tariffs to eliminate this threat, and hoping that the uncertainty brings us to a new planning, to a new wave, at least for the next 4 years, incorporating uncertainty to the planning process.
But is there something specific that the companies you represent want to see out of at least a renegotiated USMCA, if not the negotiations about the tariffs? Like, is there an angle that,
yes,
that Mexico wants for its own interest?
Yes, obviously there are some situations in the actual USMCA, CUSMA-TEMEC, for example, the labor decisions, in which Mexico has been put into a different bucket than Canada and the US, for example, and we should think about a region and not having exemptions or special definitions. This is looking at the past negotiations, and to the future negotiations, I think that we should involve more the EV manufacturing. We should review more the software, the connectivity. These things were not included, at least with the actual scope, at the former USMCA CUSMA-TEMEC. We should really have this new possibilities to review with new eyes, and this is what our members are looking for. We know that something that will be in the negotiations is the panel that Canada and Mexico won. This is something that will be there because the need of involving tier 2s and 3s, delivering more origin from North America is something that will be involved in the negotiations. This is something that we can't erase. We were also, I think MEMA was on our side in this, but we will review for sure the new treaty with this sense.
Great, thanks. So earlier this morning we heard from Matthew Fortier in his address saying, you know, if you could speak to the Prime Minister, what would you say to him? And it made me smile a little bit because tomorrow Prime Minister Trudeau is coming to GTA. He's going to assemble a meeting of the Economic Summit stakeholders, of which Flavio is one of them. So instantly I was like, okay, Flavio, what are you going to say to the Prime Minister tomorrow? What ideas are you going to bring to the table to navigate the next 30 days for sure, but really, let's be realistic, several years after that?
I'll say that from the first time we renegotiated the NAFTA, these three organizations worked very closely together because companies like NEMAC, which are headquartered in Mexico, are members of INA, MEMA, and APMA. Martin Rea up the street, members. Dana, members in all three organizations. When we talk to people like the Prime Minister, like Brad at the U.S. Consulate, we say there is no more integrated sector than the automotive sector in North America. And if you understand that from a statistical point of view, then you have different conversations. 2 million cars get made in Canada a year, 12 million in the U.S., 4 million in Mexico. About 50% of the cars made here are American brands. 50% of the parts that go in all of the cars, including the Japanese ones, Harkan is looking at me because he knows, are American. They come from American plants, but they might come from Canadian companies' American plants. Because there's 156 Canadian auto parts plants in the U.S. in 19 states and 120 in Mexico, 50,000 employees, 60,000 employees. Where do we get our steel? Well, we got a lot of it in Hamilton, but we got a lot of it in Pennsylvania. I know Joe is here somewhere. Joe McCabe, where are you? He's in Philadelphia. He likes the Kansas City Chiefs, which is kind of weird. But he's from a steel-producing state that is also a Trump-producing state. States that are important to this administration that we buy a lot of steel from. And we buy resins from Texas. You know, we keep talking about the immutable Canadian card in bitumen. And what do you make resins out of? And where does it go? We have no refinery production here, it goes there. And when you can illustrate to the person who goes to the negotiating table, and by the way, there's no negotiating table right now. In the USMCA discussions, there were tables and timelines, and we had chief negotiators who were unelected, and we had the designated ministers or secretaries who were responsible. Right now there isn't, there's just chaos. So the chief negotiator is the Prime Minister of Canada, who by the way is out of a job on March the 9th, which is important because we have uncertainty. At least now he looks like he's got who is he handing the reins to, and then who does he hand it to after that? So what we say is, don't screw up a good thing. That's to the Americans. So what you may have heard me say more than a few times is that the industry will shut down immediately, within a week, if we have 25% tariffs. Now, that's bold. I know you and I, the three of us have been having this conversation. I can say things here that are a little different than some of the things you might say somewhere else because we're the smallest partner in this. 500 companies, 740 companies, 230 companies. You got to fight when you're the smallest one. And what we say is, who's the importer of record? Because that's who pays the tariff. So on Tuesday at midnight, somebody was going to have to pay 25% more for seats from London that go into Toledo, Ohio. Stellantis was going to pay that bill? No. The guys in London are going to pay that bill? No. Why? Stellantis makes 6% a year. The seat company might make 7% a year.
That's 6.5 now.
Oh, well, there you go. Right? 25 minus 6.5 is don't make cars. And we did that when the pandemic hit, March 17th, 2020. President Trump, for the first time, said, well, it's a pandemic. I was just kidding. And on March 18th, we shut production because we couldn't get parts. You can't make a car without all the parts. And you can't buy those seats at Walmart if you don't get them from Broza. And then when the Ambassador Bridge shut down and we couldn't get parts going, the entire industry shut down. Now, why is that different if what you're doing is asking the Toledo, Ohio Jeep plant to book a $4,000 loss on every one of the cars they make that day, and you're going to make $1,000 that day? Your production schedule for a week says you're going to book $20 million in losses. Not going to happen. And so we started with that position publicly because you can't get into every room. I was in a WebEx with the White House on Saturday listening to them talk about fentanyl. Now, you think you have a national crisis in fentanyl? Wait until the auto sector shuts down. There's 125,000 jobs in the US in automotive for production of vehicles for import into Canada or are employed by Canadian part suppliers. And you've got 900,000 people in your country and 2 million people in yours. That's a crisis. If they're home from work, you got a problem. So it's easy when I sit in front of the Prime Minister, he knows this now. That's why when he went out and did it, I thought a great speech on Saturday night, whether you like him or not, he was like, all right, we're responding. The first thing he says is, we got to protect the auto sector. Now Mona knows we don't have a Canadian auto company, but we got suppliers. And we want a whole bunch of investments in battery and electrification that we need to protect. First thing on his mind is automotive.
Flavio, I think you brought up a good point here. Each of our associations has different areas of responsibility. I work in the United States, you work in Canada, you work in Mexico. But the companies you listed, they're multinational companies. And even though my mission is to ensure that US manufacturing is competitive, when we work and talk with our companies, they're not talking just about the United States, they're not talking about just about Canada and Mexico. They ask us to make sure that this region is treated as something special and that the USMCA agreement continues to live on, because the United States cannot be competitive without Canada and Mexico, and likewise, because of how interrelated the jobs and the companies are. As I was driving from Detroit, I live in Auburn Hills, Michigan. There's a Martin Rea building right by where I live. There's a Broza building, and guess what? I saw a Broza building as I was driving on the 401 from Windsor. The companies are so interrelated, and the work that is done is so interrelated, that to talk about U.S. manufacturing competitiveness, in the same breath we have to talk about the rest of North American manufacturing competitiveness.
And I'm torn, because I could take this in two different directions in terms of the question. One is an external force that's also playing into this with China, because I definitely want to loop that part of the discussion into this. But maybe before that, just a question I have in my mind, and I think probably a lot of people in this room have, is when you have an industry that is so highly integrated, the most integrated industry in the world, the North American auto industry, and you have essentially jingoism, political behavior playing into it, how do you keep the industry steady? Like, every single one of you has talked about uncertainty, and really there being, chaos and no plan and no agenda. It's just like holding on. How are you providing stability and support for your members? How can your members keep functioning in this?
Francisco.
I think that the uncertainty started a few years ago, not the political one, but the one with the ICE and EVs. The policies, the public policies that were installed in different countries started with this uncertainty. Obviously, that was a technical uncertainty, a markets uncertainty, and now it sums up with the political uncertainty. But at least in Mexico, we are accustomed to work with unpredictability and with uncertainty for years. This was in the 80s maybe, with huge inflation. There was uncertainty on many other things, financially speaking. Then when you have this possibility of manage uncertainty, this is very maybe rigorous to say, planning with uncertainty, this doesn't exist per se, but this is how it works in Mexico. You build up many scenarios, and the idea of those scenarios is that the association has to work with so many scenarios. We're not only working nowadays, for example, with the BEF, the classical BEF with ICE, we're also starting to review hydrogen because it's a fact that Mexico will produce hydrogen next year. There's obviously in the far future maybe the possibility of the fuel cells, electric vehicles and other things in our continent. I know that Japan and Germany are already working on that. Things like that, and with this uncertainty of Trump, is something that we are living with. We learned to live with it 8 years ago, now restarting. And we know that we can manage this as an association with information and also connecting, networking, and obviously having all the needs of the non-cheating and so on. But the idea is to work with our associates and to give information that is provided by Collin, by Flavio also, because The decisions are made, as you already explained, in North America, not in Mexico, not in the US, not in Canada. It's in North America, for North America, and in this way we are moving, we're dancing the same song.
I think among the three of us, we're all leading associations, and we're all different people, and we all have different styles of how we lead. But for me, there's really three things in a time like this. First, it does take collaboration and communication. On Monday, we were on the phone talking about, hey, what are you doing? How are you talking to your members? What are you saying? So that's first and foremost, and not only among us, but among our members and among those that we want a seat at the table at. I think the goal of all of us is to make sure that we have a seat at the table and that our members are represented, whether with customers, government officials, the public. So that's the first thing. The next thing is speaking with accurate and correct data and information. So as we discuss and as we make sure we're all on the same page, it's making sure that there's that clarity out there, and we're all saying the same thing. We're all saying that USMCA is vital. Now, it's vital for some different reasons for each country, and the trade numbers are different, and our interdependencies are different, but we all speak the same thing. We all have clarity. And then it takes really being decisive, but also being calm at times. And that's what, I think that's what makes it possible for us to get through times like this is you communicate, as you have the right information, and you project a bit of calmness to those that you're responsible for and those that you're speaking to. You may not have all of the information, and that's okay. But that's important, and I think that's an important lesson that we take is, like Flavio said, it is week 2. It feels like, feels like a year or two. But we still do need to project a sense of level-headedness as well.
We're talking trade war, but we're not actually at war. And in just a vernacular that's different, war, you set loose your side and it just breaks things. In a trade war, you gotta have your ears open. We went to the brink on Tuesday. In the automotive business, the brink is the end of the shift on Monday. And we had to ship stuff. 1 hour before the end of the last shift, before the trade war starts, the Prime Minister says, we've achieved a 30-day stay, just after the President of Mexico did. Now, what did we learn? Like, other than, maybe we can handle more stress than we thought. But key allies emerged who aren't necessarily allies of Canada. They're like, Chuck Grassley couldn't care less about Canada. But he did say, as he thought we were going to the brink, God, I should say something. I represent a state that has a lot of farmers. Those farmers need Canadian potash. And if the price of potash goes up 25%, those farmers are underwater. Like, oh, Chuck Grassley's on the list. We spent in this country weeks in November saying, Mexico, if they can't live up to our fight against the Chinese, then maybe they're not our real partners. Ashley's gonna smile because she hates when I do this, but she sends me the Premier of Ontario's release at 7:15 in the morning saying, the Premier just said, tell Mexico to fly a kite. Transnational shipments of Chinese goods and steel. And I got on the phone with the Premier before 8 o'clock that morning and I said, not happening anymore. Like, might have been a conversation in 2016 before we redid the USMCA. There's 120 Ontario-owned plants in Mexico where it's our only growth market because the Canadian market's come down from 3.1 million cars in 1998 to under 2 million this year. And maybe your focus should be Chinese cars sold in Mexico and that's a foothold on the beach that might be of concern for North American car production, but it's not a parts issue. And by the way, we can't do this without Mexico. Now, I take some credit because when the Premier came out, he was talking about cars. But we spent how much time on the phone, Francisco? And people like Eugenio Madero, who runs Rossini, the biggest parts supplier in Mexico, saying, what are you doing? And And is this the position of the APMA? Is that why Doug Ford is talking about that? Well, Doug Ford is also a politician, and he understands that these things resonate here, whether they're based in fact or not. And what we need to do is get them back around. We can't do this. Canadian part suppliers can't transition to electric platforms, which is what every single company is invested in, although some have had to go back to Super Duty trucks. Marlene's in the room somewhere. Suppliers don't care. I mean, yes, of course, you all know me. I've got a preference. But they don't care as long as there's healthy volumes. You can't have healthy volumes without the three countries working together. When Claudia Scheinbaum made her deal, when Claudia Scheinbaum, in her first response to the president was, okay, well, you're going to lose 400,000 jobs in the U.S. You know, and everybody said, oh, the Mexicans are fighting back out loud. This is going to go well. Analysts read that. Money managers read that. Car companies read that. We figured out at the brink that we have people with common cause in both countries who we have to spend the next 30 days talking to and arming with information. You don't have to care about me, or the people who make cars in Oakville, or people who are making tools in Windsor. Frankly, if you dislike them, that's okay too. But potash will still cost the same. And if we don't spend the next 30 days arming those people with common cause, we've wasted those 30 days. Somebody asked me yesterday on air, what is the optimal tariff level in automotive? 0. It's been 0 since 1965. What's the benefit to the American economy for tariffs in automotive? 0. So it's okay to take tough positions. It sounds like we don't want to negotiate. Every % tariff hurts a job in Michigan, or a plant in Ohio, or in Illinois. Collin does a great job telling that story in the US and waking up his members. Colleague organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers joining MEMA out loud saying, this is bad, is why the market tanked on Monday. It didn't tank because they saw me on CBC. But I give permission to everybody by doing 147 interviews since January 1st to use the facts that we put in the ether. And I woke up to a story on Fox in Huntsville, Alabama on Monday when the congressman from the 14th district in Huntsville said, are you really saying that Mercedes-Benz is going to close here, their production? Yeah, I am. And you can bet against me, but the market's going to be the one that gives the answer. And so part of the thing that we do together is we share accurate information, not just with governments, but with people who make money decisions. And then when Francisco talks about how we need to work together, especially in this transition, and that's what's making people uneasy. If you're a supplier in Canada, Brampton is closed. One of our 8 assembly plants is closed. Oakville is closed. Windsor's just come back up because we're paying for the retooling of a plant for a product that is lower volume than it replaced. Should we do it? Yeah. Because regardless of Donald Trump, the industry is going to electrons instead of combustion. And not because of anything that we say, but because Beijing has bet that way. So we should absolutely continue down this path. We're going to have some tough years. And right now, those suppliers whose balance sheets are brittle because they don't have the volume that used to be at Ingersoll. I don't know if anybody from General Motors is here. General Motors made a big investment to switch from internal combustion engine Equinoxes to being the exclusive plant for the Bright Drop product, which is a good commercial electric vehicle. Well, the volumes are 10 to 1. So if you're a supplier and you were getting an order for 300,000 armrests, and you're going to now supply the new product, it's 30,000. And so I know we have spent the last few years rallying around that, my God, we landed $50 billion of investment. We launched the Arrow, we went around the world and talked about it. At the supplier level, everybody's a little bit weaker right now. It couldn't be a worse time for Donald Trump to shoot his own foot. And the message from all of us is, there aren't 3 sets of feet. It's one. You're sinking everybody.
So very quickly, because I want to make sure that we do have time for audience questions, we will be taking those, so please get your thoughts together while we finish off the discussion, but the mics are right there. Okay, so you segued us beautifully into China. So let's talk about that, because, I mean, all of you sound very logical, and, it's a very convincing argument, and I know that the numbers back up that it's actually just the truthful argument. But there is an element of logicality, perhaps, that's at play here, or not fully understanding the implications outside of North America. And previously, like during the Biden administration, it was all, we need the Can-Am Mexico fortress against China. That's the threat. We're going to put tariffs on. We're going to rally together. Now, we're going to fight amongst each other, punish China a little bit, but not very much. And I'm wondering where that leaves us vulnerable as a continent to this threat that we had identified before, particularly as it pertains to EVs, because as you said, Flavio, they are leading pretty much in all areas of the supply chain on that front. So do you want to just continue your train of thought, and then we'll go to the rest of the group?
I'll be brief. I know that'll surprise people. The Chinese have a different system, and before Donald Trump won on November 6th, what we were talking about was Canada, US, and hopefully Mexico as let's incubate the industry here, the transition for the next 5 years or so. We're going to put a big tariff wall. We're going to put restrictions on foreign direct investment and M&A activity with the Chinese state-owned players. I know everybody thinks that BYD is different. I think BYD is a great experiment by the Chinese to confuse us. A good company with great product, certainly part of the Chinese cluster. Put these tariffs up to help some of these investments bear fruit before we say compete. That was the best shot that we had to be able to hold back the Chinese. Somebody asked me, I took a Collin show on talk radio, and they said, oh, will you take some callers? And somebody says, you're not going to like this, but isn't this an opportunity now to make a deal with the Chinese, to make a deal with BYD or SAIC? And I said, well, you're going to be surprised. In 2016 and 17, when this government said we should pursue a free trade agreement with China, we pursued Guangzhou Auto and Shanghai Auto heavily. Mona, you know this because we did this with the Ontario Centers of Excellence at the time, and now OCI. And we said, okay, we've got the NAFTA rules, the USMCA rules, invest here. And we'll figure that part out. Well, the White House asked us to execute an extradition request for the CFO of Huawei. We arrested the CFO of Huawei because we're a rule of law country, and our ally asked us to. On that exact same day, SAIC was here meeting with me in the Premier's office and then the Prime Minister's office. That deal was dead. And all of those deals were dead. And then we had the pandemic where they had the run of show. Chinese companies operate differently. There is no content in Chinese vehicles made in China from the US, Mexico, or Canada. They are confident. They are competent. Automotive is one of the pillars of the Chinese rise. Why would they concede any space to us? When one of those companies wanted to do an investment in Stratford, Ontario to make glass for vehicle use, they asked for infrastructure quantums that we couldn't give them in water and electricity. And then they asked for carve-outs for labor. We'll bring our own laborers. And so what I said to that caller is, you're going to make a deal with the Chinese because you like their product. But you got to be able to afford their product. You have to have your job, and you have to have your future. If you want that product, you can buy it. You just pay double what the list price is. And by the way, they're lowering the list price so they can buy the market share from you. You'll have your opportunity.
Francisco, do you want to jump in with thoughts? Because obviously Mexico, as Flavio alluded to earlier, Mexico had tense discussions with Canada and the U.S. over, Chinese vehicles and imports.
It was at the, let's say, end of Biden, beginning of Trump era, in which it was, I think, wrong information on the floor. And I'll bring some data from the investment of China in North America for the past 10 years. 93% of this investment has happened in the US, 6.4 in Canada, and only 0.6 in Mexico. From the imports today of auto parts to the region, almost 50-something%, almost 60 goes to the US, 20-something% to Mexico, and 20-something% to Canada. This means that there was a misunderstanding only, I say, because of the marketing of the Chinese cars. Yes, the Chinese cars are being sold in Mexico. As Joe mentioned, almost 7% of those cars that were sold in Mexico came from China with Chinese marks. But also GM is the #1 importer of Chinese cars with 60-something%, Ford with 20% of the China, because it's a mix that they have to bring the cheapest cars from China. This is a business model that all the companies have. Also, this business model doesn't affect directly. It benefits because it led us to produce the more value-added cars in Mexico and not going back to the cheaper cars. This brings also that some investments, yes, they are coming mainly from Taiwan, and those investments are helping, for example, Tesla. Tesla is inviting those companies that were formerly settled in China, but there were Taiwanese capital and coming to Mexico. And this Chinese mix is mixing up some thoughts, obviously, because we still think that we are a global sector, that we need, for example, germanium, wolfram, and other elements that we're waiting in Canada that you produce them, and then we can shift. But for the moment, we need, obviously, for the EVs, a lot of supplies from other countries. Korea, yes. China, yes. But also there was an idea that there was the possibility to build a plant in Mexico for Chinese cars to sell in the US. As I was talking to the Governor Blunt, the incredible idea of producing in Mexico with 75% of value content, it was easier to do this in Korea with 25%. Then there were so many misunderstandings, as I said, that what we have to do is work as a region, and not only as having more and more walls against others. Now we have to review the Nissan situation, the Volkswagen closing so many plants. It's not only China, it's the world, it's the automotive sector, and we have to benefit from this shake and not only build walls, but to review how to attract from Volkswagen, from Nissan, and from the rest of all the new automakers that also Joe mentioned, that there are a lot coming still, we will have another one in Mexico, Olinia, and this means that there are huge possibilities for the auto parts sector, and mainly for North America.
Yeah. I agree with you, Flavio. I like the question previously from the student about, why is this a good segment to be in? Mm-hmm. Automotive is fantastic. There are so many opportunities. For me, myself, I have built a career not even expecting to be in automotive. And I want to touch a little bit on the situation with China. So we woke up on Tuesday with a 10% tariff on China in the United States. And I firmly believe that there's a longer play and strategy here with China in relation to the United States. But the reason why it's so important that we as a region talk about manufacturing competitiveness in each of our countries and together is because if you look at China, they are about 40 to 50% overcapacitized right now on the OEM production side. On the supplier side, it's even worse. It is a race to the bottom. It's a price war. And tariffs only do so much. They do put up some walls, they do put up some barriers, but innovation, I firmly believe, overcomes all of that. And so if you don't think the Chinese aren't going to fight like hell to fill their plants and to employ their people, you need to change your thinking. Just like we're fighting like hell to protect our market, to protect our manufacturers, our employment, and our jobs. And so, and right now, honestly, if you visit Chinese plants, if you're in their cars, they're good. The level of automation in their facilities is beyond what we have, and they're making the strides to be very competitive. And so, for a time, yes, maybe strategic things like tariffs are in play. But that's where we need to coalesce as a region and think about manufacturing competitiveness, how we put people into jobs, how we automate our facilities, how we bring higher levels of technology to make sure that we have that robust supply chain that can compete. Because if you look at the trade, U.S. auto exports, Canada and Mexico, by far and away the biggest export markets for the United States. China doesn't even scratch the surface. So it's vital for the U.S. market to have that, but we need to be very much eyes wide open about what's happening globally. We somewhat protect ourselves. If you look at the entire map of the world, the United States and Canada are pretty much the only markets without any Chinese cars. We're a little bit insulated, and I don't think we see the threat that's coming at us. And so it's important that we create policies as a region around tax incentives, education, employment, creating zones of manufacturing that can combat this, because that's the threat that we face, and it is very real. And it's important that we wake up to that and start fighting and moving in that direction to create policies that promote competitiveness and limit the infighting. That's why USMCA is so vital to the success of this region.
Let's take a pause up here and see if there are any audience questions that we can get to. Feel free to just stand and make your way. Good. Oh, you might not be on yet, James. Do you want to try again?
Hi, I'm James.
A little better, yeah.
Okay, question here. Obviously we see that, as you mentioned before, that we have very high tariffs for Chinese vehicles in North America at 100%. Almost every other country is much lower. How do you frame the potential competitiveness of the North American, both suppliers and OEMs, in a protected environment like that? In other words, how can the North American OEMs and suppliers be competitive on a global basis in the long term?
So let me take a first shot at that one, because I got a passionate answer for you. So if you like a product, that's good. I mean, we're all consumers. And if you like the Chinese cars, that's good. There's much to talk about there. There's a high degree of functionality, especially that comes off the base of an electrified platform. You want options, they're there. But that's a consumer outlook. If you're in the automotive business, or if you're in adjacent businesses, technology, raw materials, or in critical minerals, you got to ask yourself, does the market pull technology investments and innovation investments? And if it can, if that's part of the country's industrial policy, then you want to protect investments that you make. I wrote a piece in the Financial Post that went across the Post Media network that said, ask yourself why they're so cheap, and the dynamics that drive those costs down, are those the same values that we have here? Are those the shared values, notwithstanding our current spat with the Americans? Is that the same values that we have in North America? If the pricing of a product is a function of geopolitics, you can buy it and consume it. You can revere it. But you also have to then understand what happens when a material part of your market follows that. And you want Ford's, Marlene, I'm pointing right at you, you want Ford's Oakville plant that employs thousands of people and 12,000 people in the supply chain, and another 20,000 people in the support industries, to have the benefit of the Canadian government being as strategic as the Chinese government. We have a consumer, we haven't banned anything in this country. You can buy anything you want. Those companies want to sell those cars here, they just have to get them federally certified, and they will, because the safety standards aren't that much different than the other markets where they're at. Is that a good idea from a Canadian standpoint when so much of, that young man in the corner there in a white shirt who's in computer engineering here at York University, there he is raising hands, he probably studies what the Chinese can do on product so that he can learn and he can be on this stage 30 years from now. If in the interim we say we gave that market up to get the cheap hit, then what did we do that lives up to the responsibilities that we had?
Anyone else have thoughts for James's question?
Hard to follow that one.
I think that's why we focus so much on the competitive nature and creating an ecosystem here in North America that drives the ability for us to innovate and to bring those technologies here, because competition is a threat. It's always a threat. That's what's made this region so powerful, is because of our ability to compete on a global level. There's always going to be people that want a piece of that. That's just the nature of competition. And I think if I were a supplier sitting here, I would say, okay, I need to understand my supply base. I need to understand, where is everything coming from? How do I compete? What are my sources of materials, my raw materials? Who are my customers? And then how do I in-source the best technology, the best people, and the best ways of building my part so that I compete on a global level? Many of our suppliers, they're actually making a lot of money in China right now, doing very well, and they're bringing some of that technology. So it's a global ecosystem that we have to compete in, and it's important to realize that and bring those abilities and technologies here to this region.
And I would say research and development keeps us competitive. Labor pools, I think that this is a huge thing. Training, education, and also orientation, because there's a gap now in some countries that people doesn't want to work in manufacturing. And the other thing is not only to look to China, what they are doing, also Japan, also Germany, also obviously Canada and the US are developing things. I think that we have to understand that globally we can have the best and most competitive area in the world. Also because we have the largest consuming market, this helps obviously for the competitiveness and the size, but we should focus on research development and labor pools.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? That's fine.
Maybe I could, one more comment on what you said. Innovation. Oftentimes innovation is cited as a reason why we shouldn't do something. It could risk jobs if we automate or we innovate. But if you look at since the Industrial Revolution in the 1600s, we've only employed more people. We've only improved the standard of living across the world. And so innovation is always the way to do that. It does make things better. It does create opportunities. There may be a very short amount of pain. There may be some people impacted. But if you look at the Industrial Revolution, we've only employed more people and made the standard of living hopefully better across the world.
And who's the number one laggard? China. Because they've seen what we can do when you bring to bear industrial policy in technology and in resources. They've seen how long we take to approve natural resource extraction. I won't argue on the reasons, we've got good reasons. They say, well, we can jump the line. They see what we do when we close coal producing, coal-fired energy producing infrastructure, and they say, we can jump the line. And we need to, because we need to feed people, but they don't do it in the same way that we do. They don't offer to the people if you've got a difference of opinion, here's somebody who's organized ideas, and you can change who's in charge if you like. The idea there is let's jump as quickly as we can with the scale that we have past the American sphere. And we're all being distracted by Donald Trump right now, and I think that we absolutely have to pay attention. But the actual global balance of power is between the Chinese sphere and the American sphere. It's just that the sphere that we're in is a blender at the moment. What do we have this is an EV conference, and I'm going to go back to how Canada, what we've been saying, how's Canada going to be a superpower in EVs? A lot of people here, of course, are an applied technology end of it. At the core of it, you've got to be able to take electrons, put them in something, and dispatch them where you need them. And then you've got to be able to, whatever that thing is, you've got to turn around and then refill that with electrons, hopefully with something that doesn't burn coal, because otherwise we're all hypocrites. And then you've got to do that better than everybody else. So you can work on it in your lab. You can work on the advanced mechanics and the advanced electronics to put it together. But at the core of it, it's stuff. It's in the ground. That's got to be extracted, processed, refined, applied. You throw some science at it, you make it denser, and you put it in cars right now. The best opportunity for critical resources, or critical minerals, scale is cars. That's why EVs matter. From a geopolitical point of view, who cares how you get from A to B, except that in this industry, you can scale that. And so if we're going to offer an alternative to China, and that we're going to offer it somehow through all of this, through our American allies, then we've got to figure out how we can answer to Ford. Again, Marlene, when can you get lithium phosphate? When can you get 20,000 tons of it battery grade? The answer is, I don't know. And so we're having a big economic summit and an industrial summit and a political summit with the Prime Minister tomorrow, and we're going to be bringing in CEOs and thought leaders and union leaders from around one of the tables that has to absolutely produce meat is how do you turn our critical minerals advantage into an immutable card to play like oil and gas. Oil and gas, Dave, if he wants a million barrels today, he knows he's got to tap into a pipeline, but it's there. Okay, become a client of that. How do you become a client of graphite in this country? Where are you going to get it? Brad's smirking because I'm smirking because I know the answer. But that answer is an irrepeatable business model. There is no connection right now to us being a critical mineral superpower and actually trading that chip at a table somewhere. So the challenge here in this country is to say, if you believe in electrification, if you believe those are one of the pillars where the American sphere can hold back and maybe beat the Chinese sphere, then you have to have a national objective that says, instead of 2035, every car is going to be an EV, because you make yourself vulnerable to actually who makes them. By 2035, this amount of volume in these critical minerals is going to be available at market. And we're going to have investments in processing in this country. 85% of the world's processing in critical minerals is in China. How much is in the US? Right. That's a real answer, because there isn't any. Shouldn't we invest in that? Could we invest in that? Isn't that a noble cause? So if we do that, and we need Mexico to help us compete with the Chinese, Mexico can be a battery superpower. They know that that pipeline of cobalt will come from here. And when we sit and we say, please don't ruin our day in Washington and Detroit, and please, our best allies are right here. If I don't do anything, but Collin does his job right, our interests are so aligned, Canada wins. Same thing with Francisco. But shouldn't we be able to deliver graphite? If we say you're going to make batteries, but the anodes are going to buy graphite from China, but we have it in the ground, and we're in a moment of crisis right now, and we don't do anything about it, it's unconscionable. And so if you're in the EV business here, and you're either on the vehicle or in the ecosystem or in the energy space, you probably want to tell anybody who makes a decision to say, I want to be able to sell to Marlene the stuff that we have with a price we can predict. If we do that, then I can predict how many of those York University students are going to have jobs in 10, 20 years from now in the EV space. And remember, when you're looking at the great architectural wonders of the world, somebody chipped a rock. It all comes down to that. And we can still be an outsized player without Aero Motors or some Canadian player. We don't need that. We've got the hedge against Chinese dominance in critical minerals. We just need the leadership.
And I wanted to bring Francisco and Collin in on that as well, because one of the things I wanted to end with was a bit of a call to action. It's very clear from what all of you have said that there's an understanding gap between the people in the industry and representing the industry versus the people at the legislative level making decisions. So you've all been super generous with your time. And, Flavio, I think that's a really relevant call to action for the room. But Collin and Francisco, do you have anything else that you would want everyone here to take away so that they can, pay the education forward, hopefully, to the people making decisions over the next critical 30 days and then the 4 years after that?
My one thing is lean in. You've got to get involved because we're all working our butts off to get a seat at the table. And whether it's a new administration or an established administration, that's our job, is to make sure that the supplier industry has a seat at the table. And we have very competent people doing that. So what I would ask people is to lean in and get involved, because there is a way to affect policy change in our countries, and that's through working with groups like ourselves, those in Washington, D.C., and as we do that, as we align and share very clear information, the data is pretty clear. We have to have a region that is built on principles of competition and free trade. We have that. We've been successful at it. We need to continue to show that. Sometimes it's a little harder when you represent 500 companies. It takes us a little longer to get some of the data than the 10 or 14 OEMs that can compile it quicker. But just lean in and get involved. That would be my one suggestion.
Mine would be emphasizing the teamwork. The teamwork, yes, among us, but also inside the associations, as you mentioned. Please join and have this discussion. We should be the ones who can, as you mentioned, change the public policy, but also to develop new things. Research and development is not only technical, but also marketing and other things like subsidies, and I don't know what could come in the future. And obviously, with the most important thing that we have in the industry, that it's the talent that's in the industry. Still, we need to develop more because there's the EVs growing and coming up, at least in our region. And I think that we have to push to have the best people on board.
Let me add one thing before you wrap and tell me to be quiet.
You've got 30 seconds.
These two gentlemen run organizations that matter in Mexico City, in Detroit, and Washington. And if you're looking for your interests to be looked after, avenues and doors to be open, they run not-for-profits, as do I. And a lot of people say, well, you're going to do the work anyway. I can't afford a membership. That's how Francisco accesses Mexico City. And that's how Collin accesses Lansing and Washington, D.C. It's important to figure out that when you lean in, you also got to help keep the lights on. And I say this, I've never said this, in 10 years, 11 years in this job, everybody's looking at a ration what they spend. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish. If you want to do business in Mexico, you call Francisco because his team can help you. And if you've got interest in the US and you're not part of MEMA, what are we talking about? Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you, so much. There are trillions of dollars in trade on the line here, so this was an essential conversation, and really grateful to all of you for making it. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Emma.